My parents ignored my hard work while praising my sister, so I moved out silently and built a life they could never touch. I'm a 26-year-old guy who's always been the quiet overachiever in my family, while my younger sister was celebrated for doing the bare minimum, and somehow that role wrapped around my identity so tightly I forgot what it felt like to be seen. Every time I brought home a perfect report card or landed another promotion, my parents would barely look up from their phones and sigh, "Well, that's what we expect from you," like consistency was my curse instead of my strength. I remember standing in the dim kitchen after a long shift, grease still clinging faintly to my skin, hearing my mother gush over my sister's C-grade exam, her voice sugary and proud, saying, "See? She tried, that's all that matters," while my own effort dissolved into silence. Inside, it stung in a way I couldn't explain without sounding bitter, so I swallowed it and told myself I was just being dramatic, that strong people didn't need applause. The walls of our home always felt colder around me, like they knew I didn't quite belong, and every compliment my sister received echoed in my chest like proof that I was invisible. When I tried to speak up once, my father frowned and said, "Why are you making this into an issue? You're the mature one," and my sister smirked, her eyes sparkling with quiet victory. Emotionally, I was drowning in unspoken questions. Why did love feel like a competition I could never win, and why did excellence feel so painfully lonely? I started measuring my worth by how little trouble I caused, convincing myself that silence was safer than being labeled ungrateful. Still, a small part of me clung to the hope that one day they'd notice, that they'd finally look at me and say, "We're proud of you." But the more I tried to earn that moment, the further it seemed to drift away, and one night, I overheard something that made my heart drop. This happened when I was 21, and I started realizing it wasn't just in my head. The favoritism was real, loud, and painfully obvious. I remember sitting at the dining table, the wormwood cool beneath my palms, as my sister bragged about dropping another class, and my mother laughed softly, brushing her hair back and saying, "She's just finding herself, give her time." When I mentioned I'd been offered a leadership role at work, my father didn't even look at me, muttering, "That's good," as if I'd told him the weather, not a milestone I'd bled for. The imbalance sat heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, like a fog that never lifted. Inside, I felt this slow, burning humiliation, like every ounce of effort I poured into being responsible only made me more invisible. My sister leaned back in her chair, twirling her fork, and said with a lazy grin, "You're always so serious, relax for once," while my mother nodded in agreement, as if I was the problem for caring too much. I wanted to scream that I was tired of being the stable one, the dependable one, the one who never got celebrated, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. Emotionally, it felt like I was shrinking, like I was slowly erasing myself just to keep the peace. That night, as the house hummed with quiet and the corridor light flickered, I replayed every moment in my mind, every instance where her chaos was forgiven and my discipline was ignored. I whispered to myself, "Why does it feel like I have to earn a place in my own family?" And the question echoed painfully into the darkness. When I finally tried to address it, my father snapped, "Don't compare yourself to your sister, she's sensitive," and my mother added, "You're stronger, you can handle more," as if that justified everything. The realization cut deep. I wasn't their son, I was their solution, their emotional shield, the one expected to carry weight without ever bending. And as I sat alone in my room, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight through my curtains, I couldn't shake the growing fear that this wasn't just unfair, it was intentional. This happened when I was 19, the year I started juggling college classes with a late-night job just to keep myself afloat without asking them for anything. I remember the sharp smell of cheap instant coffee clinging to my clothes as I stumbled home past midnight, my body aching, while my sister lounged on the couch scrolling through her phone like life owed her comfort. My parents never asked how exhausted I was, only if I transferred my portion of the household money yet. When I quietly mentioned my tuition deadline, my mother sighed and said, "We'll see what's left after your sister's needs," like my future was conditional and hers was guaranteed. Inside, I felt this deep, humiliating ache, the kind that makes you question whether love is supposed to hurt this much. I paid my own fees, skipped meals, and learned how to stretch every rupee, while they funded her shopping trips without hesitation. One evening, I overheard my sister whining, "He's so boring, all he does is work and study," and my father chuckled, replying, "That's just how he is, dependable," as if my sacrifices were personality traits instead of quiet desperation. Emotionally, it felt like I was slowly becoming invisible by design, like the more responsible I became, the less human they saw me as. I started wondering why my dreams felt optional in my own home. I whispered to myself, am I only valuable when I'm useful? And the question sat heavy in my chest, suffocating and raw. When I finally tried to ask for help one night, my mother frowned and said, don't start complaining, you're stronger than this, and my sister rolled her eyes, murmuring, drama again. The words sliced through me, sharp and careless, confirming what I tried so hard to ignore. The house felt colder after that, quieter in a way that wasn't peace but emotional abandonment. As I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, a sick realization crept in, they didn't just rely on my strength, they needed it to keep her fragile fantasy intact. And the more I understood that, the more I felt something inside me begin to harden, preparing for whatever painful truth was waiting just ahead. I'm a 26-year-old guy who learned the sickest truth on a random evening that started like any other, quiet and heavy, the air smelling faintly of overcooked rice and detergent. I was passing the hallway when I heard my sister's voice slip through the half-closed door, sweet and calculated, saying, he thinks he's better than all of us now, always acting superior, and my stomach clenched before I even reached the corner. My mother responded softly, almost sympathetically, he's changed, I don't know what's gotten into him, and my father added, he's always had that cold edge, as if my discipline was a moral flaw. I stood there frozen, heart pounding, realizing she wasn't misunderstanding me, she was rewiring their perception on purpose. Inside, something cracked, not loudly but in that slow, quiet way that hurts more, like glass splitting beneath pressure. I felt betrayed not just by her lies, but by how easily they accepted them, how quickly my role shifted from dependable to distant villain. I pushed the door open and asked, what are you talking about, my voice thin and shaking, and she turned with practiced innocence, replying, relax, we're just talking, don't make it dramatic. My mother avoided my eyes and murmured, you've been acting different lately, while my father sighed, we're worried about your attitude, like their concern somehow justified her poison. Emotionally, I was spiraling. Years of being ignored had transformed into years of being misrepresented, and the unfairness burned hot and familiar in my chest. I tried explaining, I've done everything for this family, my hands trembling, walls closing in, but my sister cut in sharply, you always make yourself the victim, her words sharp as ice. The room felt smaller, the ceiling lower, the air thick with accusation, and I could taste the metallic sting of held-back tears. As I walked away, every step felt heavier, like I was carrying the weight of her lies into my own isolation. In my room, staring at the shadowed corner where the paint peeled away, I realized this wasn't just neglect anymore, it was active betrayal. And the worst part was knowing she'd been doing this for a long time, maybe longer than I was ready to face. This happened over the next few weeks, as the atmosphere in our house shifted from neglect to something sharp and poisonous, like walking barefoot over broken glass. I stopped joining family dinners, not because I wanted distance, but because every shared glance felt like judgment dressed as concern. My mother's tone changed when she spoke to me, softer but colder, and my father barely acknowledged me unless it was to question my mood. My sister, on the other hand, walked around with quiet confidence, as if she'd won a battle I never knew existed. The smell of reheated food and cleaning fluids filled the air, but nothing could mask the emotional decay settling into the walls. Inside, I felt myself shrinking again, smaller than ever, like my own home was rejecting me. I'd sit on my bed staring at the dull glow of my phone, wondering how I became the villain in a story I never agreed to play. When I tried to bridge the gap, my mother would sigh and say, we just want harmony, why do you make everything tense? And my father added, your sister's sensitive right now, don't provoke her, as if my presence alone disturbed her peace. The injustice clawed at me, cold and relentless, peeling away whatever warmth I had left. One night, as rain tapped against the window and the fan hummed above me, I heard them laughing in the living room, her voice light and carefree, and the sound twisted something deep inside my chest. I whispered to myself, maybe I'm really the problem, and the thought hurt more than their words ever could. Emotionally, it felt like being slowly erased while still expected to exist for everyone else's comfort. When I walked past them the next day, my sister glanced up and said with a fake smile, still sulking, and my mother murmured, just try to be normal, their voices slicing into what little strength I had left. I retreated back to my room, heart pounding, knowing the distance between us was no longer accidental, and sensing there was more being said behind my back than I was ready to hear. This happened on a night I couldn't sleep, when the house was wrapped in heavy silence and the only sound was the soft tick of the hallway clock echoing through the darkness. I stepped out to get water, the cold tiles biting into my bare feet, and froze when I heard my parents whispering in the living room, their voices hushed but unmistakably clear. My mother sighed, exhaustion thick in her tone, and said, he's always been strong, We knew he'd handle it better than her, and my father replied calmly, "That's why we raised him to take pressure. She needs more care." The words felt unreal, like someone poured ice water straight into my veins. Inside, something shifted violently, like a puzzle snapping into place that I never wanted to see completed. They hadn't just ignored me by accident, they'd assigned me this role, molded me into resilience without kindness, while protecting her fragility at my expense. I stood there, heart racing, listening as my mother murmured, "He doesn't need validation like she does," and my father added, "He's built for this, he'll understand eventually." My chest tightened, realization crashing over me in waves. My emotional starvation wasn't neglect, it was strategy. I whispered, barely audible, "So I was never meant to be loved the same," and they startled when I stepped forward into the dim light. My mother's eyes widened, her face pale, while my father stiffened and said, "You misunderstood us." But I hadn't. Not this time. Every moment, every dismissal, every excuse suddenly made sense in the most painful way possible. I felt anger, grief, and betrayal tangling into one sharp, unbearable knot in my chest. "You decided I'd be the one who suffers," I said, voice trembling, hands clenched tight, and my mother tried to soften her tone. "We just knew you were capable." Capable. The word echoed like an insult wrapped in praise. I turned away, pulse pounding, knowing I could never unhear what they'd admitted, and realizing that something far darker was beginning to take root inside me. This happened in the quiet aftermath of their confession, when every word I'd heard replayed like a cruel mantra inside my head, refusing to fade even when the sun rose. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful, silent, emotionally distant, and their smiles felt rehearsed, almost panicked now that I knew the truth. Inside, a strange calm formed, the kind that isn't peace but preparation, like the breath you take before stepping into cold water. I started telling myself I'd survive this, but the thought came wrapped in exhaustion and a sharp, unfamiliar resolve. I remember my mother knocking lightly on my door, voice trembling as she said, "We didn't mean to hurt you," and my father adding from the hallway, "You're just overthinking this." I stared at the faded pattern of my floor, whispering, "You planned my pain," and the silence that followed felt heavier than any apology. My sister hovered nearby, arms crossed, her tone sugary and fake when she murmured, "Don't be so dramatic, you know they love us both." Emotionally, I felt detached, like the sun they shaped had finally fractured beyond repair. I began putting money aside quietly, skipping shared meals, avoiding their gazes, and spending more time outside just to breathe without tension. The night air felt cooler, freeing, carrying distant city sounds that reminded me life existed beyond these suffocating walls. Every step away from them filled me with relief and guilt at the same time, a painful blend of longing and liberation. I realized I wasn't planning a break, I was planning my escape. The house responded with more pressure. "Why are you so distant?" my mother asked, eyes watery. "We're family," my father said sternly, like blood erased emotional damage. My sister scoffed, "He thinks he's above us now," and something inside me clenched, not in anger, but in cold clarity. I knew speaking would only open wounds I could no longer afford to bleed from. As I stood in my room that night, a packed bag hidden beneath my bed, I stared at the wall I once dreamed of decorating and felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't ready yet, but I could sense the moment approaching. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that when I finally stepped out, nothing would ever be the same. This happened on a night I never planned for, the kind of moment that replays in your head long after the words stop echoing, when everything finally collapses at once. Relatives had gathered for a small family dinner, the living room thick with the smell of fried food and forced laughter, and my parents decided it was the perfect stage to expose their disappointment in me. My father raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear and said, "He's become distant and selfish lately, we don't even recognize him anymore," and my mother nodded with a sad smile, adding, "We raised him better than this." I felt every eye turn toward me, sharp and judgmental, while my sister sat there silently, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. Inside, something shattered so completely it felt physical, like my chest caving inward under invisible weight. I tried to speak, my voice trembling as I said, "You planned my suffering, you admitted it," but my mother waved her hand dismissively and replied, "Don't twist our words in front of family." My sister finally chimed in, sweet and venomous, "He's always been dramatic, he just can't stand that I get more attention," and a few relatives chuckled uncomfortably, like my pain was entertainment. The humiliation burned through me, hot and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Emotionally, I felt stripped bare, reduced to the weakest version of myself in front of people who were supposed to protect me. My heart pounded violently, ears ringing, throat tight, and I couldn't tell if the wetness on my cheeks was sweat or tears. "Why are you doing this to me?" I whispered, barely audible, and my father scoffed, "Grow up, you're too old to play victim." The words sank deep, carving into a wound already torn open. I stumbled back to my room, closing the door with shaking hands, my vision blurred, breath uneven and desperate. On the other side, I could still hear their laughter resume, casual and cruel, like I'd never existed at all. Sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the packed bag beneath it, I felt completely defeated, and for the first time, I wondered if leaving wasn't just an option, but the only way to stay alive. This happened a few days after that dinner, when the house felt quieter but not calmer, like the silence was holding its breath. I woke up before sunrise, the dim gray light slipping through the curtains, and just lay there listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside, realizing I didn't feel fear anymore, just a hollow kind of certainty. My chest still ached from the humiliation, but underneath it was something sharper, colder, almost determined. I knew if I stayed one more day, their voices would keep rewriting me until I no longer recognized who I was. I moved carefully, each step deliberate, the floorboards creaking softly as I slid the packed bag from under my bed. My hands trembled as I zipped it shut, stuffing the last of my essentials inside, and a strange wave of grief washed over me, not for them, but for the version of myself who once believed love was earned through silence. I paused at the doorway, taking one final look at the cracked walls, the faded paint, the home that never felt like home, and whispered, "I'm done bleeding for this." No one heard me, and somehow, that made it more powerful. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard my mother's muffled voice drifting from the living room, laughing at something my sister said, and the sound twisted like a knife in my ribs. My sister called out casually, "Where are you going so early?" and I froze for a second, heart pounding, before replying flatly, "Out." My father grunted from his chair, not even bothering to look at me, and that indifference sealed it. I didn't owe them an explanation they never gave me. The morning air outside was cool and crisp, brushing against my skin like freedom wrapped in fear. Every step down the path felt heavier and lighter at the same time, like I was shedding chains and memories in equal measure. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, the guilt would creep in and drag me under again. But as I walked farther away, phone vibrating in my pocket, a sudden thought tightened my chest. They hadn't realized yet that I wasn't just leaving for the day, and when they did, everything would change. This happened in the weeks after I left, when reality hit harder than the adrenaline that carried me out of that house. I moved into a tiny, almost suffocating room with peeling paint and a rattling ceiling fan, the kind of place that smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but somehow it felt safer than my own family ever did. Each night, as I lay on the thin mattress staring at the stained ceiling, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost frightening, yet strangely honest. For the first time, no one was measuring me against my sister, no one was shaping my worth for their convenience. Inside, though, the pain didn't disappear, it shifted. I woke up to notifications from my mother, message after message reading, "Where are you? This isn't funny. You're hurting us," and every word dripped with guilt instead of accountability. I could almost hear her voice through the screen, soft and wounded, like I was the cruel one for escaping their cruelty. My sister eventually texted too, colder and sharper, "You think making a scene will fix your issues," and I felt that familiar ache twist again. I worked longer hours, my hands raw and exhausted, the smell of sweat and cheap detergent clinging to my clothes, but every paycheck felt like a small piece of autonomy. Emotionally, I was caught between relief and grief, mourning a family I never truly had while trying to build a life that finally belonged to me. I whispered to myself, "You're allowed to choose peace," but some nights, that hope felt fragile as glass. One afternoon, as I stepped out into the harsh sunlight, my phone rang and my father's name flashed across the screen. His voice came through cold and strained, "You embarrassed us. Your sister's devastated. Come home and apologize." My heart pounded, old instinct pulling me back, while a quieter voice inside begged me to stay strong. I swallowed hard and replied, "I'm not coming back," and the silence on the other end felt ominous. But as I ended the call, another message appeared from an unknown number, the text short and unsettling, "We need to talk about what your sister's been hiding." And suddenly, the peace I was trying to build felt dangerously temporary. This happened just days after that message, when the fragile calm I'd built around myself shattered all over again. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the fan humming weakly overhead, staring at the unknown number like it held answers I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face. My fingers hovered before I finally typed, "What are you talking about?" and the reply came almost instantly, colder than ice. "Your sister didn't just lie about you, she lied about everything." My heart slammed against my ribs as a sick feeling crept through my stomach. He called a minute later, voice low and tense, introducing himself as a distant cousin who'd overheard something he never should have. "She's been telling family you emotionally abused her," he said, and the world tilted violently beneath me. I whispered, "What?" barely recognizing my own voice, and he continued, "She said you made her feel unsafe, that's why they treat her like glass." Every word felt like another knife, deeper, sharper, crueler than anything before. Inside, terror and fury twisted together, hot and suffocating, as memories replayed through my mind every smirk, every whisper, every moment she painted herself as fragile while I was framed as cold and distant. I could almost hear her voice saying, "He's unstable," and my chest tightened with the unbearable weight of knowing how long she'd been building this narrative. "They believed her, didn't they?" I asked, and the cousin sighed, without question. That evening, my sister finally called me herself, her tone unusually soft. "We need to fix this," she murmured, "you leaving made things worse." I felt my jaw tighten as I replied, "You told them I abused you," and a long silence stretched between us. Then she laughed nervously and said, "You're overreacting again, you always twist things." The gaslighting was so familiar it almost made me sick. Emotionally, I felt like the ground beneath my new life was cracking open, dragging old wounds back to the surface. I wasn't just escaping neglect anymore. I was escaping a lie that could destroy me. As I stared at my phone, another message flashed from that cousin. "She's desperate now. When the truth comes out, they'll turn on someone." And suddenly, I realized the confrontation I'd been avoiding was no longer optional. This happened the day I finally agreed to meet them, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I refused to let my silence protect their lies any longer. We sat in a quiet cafe, sunlight spilling across the chipped wooden table, and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and nervous sweat. My parents looked older, smaller somehow, while my sister avoided my eyes, her fingers nervously picking at her sleeve. Inside, I felt calm in a way I never had before, like my heart had already chosen freedom. "I know what you told them," I said, voice steady, and her head snapped up, eyes wide. "You said I abused you." She swallowed hard and whispered, "You're twisting things again," but there was no confidence left in her tone. I pulled out my phone, showing screenshots, recorded messages, proof from relatives she'd confided in too carelessly, and the screen's glow reflected in my mother's trembling eyes. "Is this also just me being dramatic?" I asked quietly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than all the years of neglect combined. My father finally spoke, his voice cracking, "Why would you do this to him?" and my sister burst into tears, stammering excuses about needing attention, about feeling overshadowed, about not meaning for it to go this far. Emotionally, a strange peace settled in my chest as I realized I wasn't angry anymore, I was simply done. "You didn't just lie," I told her, "you tried to destroy who I am." My mother reached out, whispering, "We failed you," and for once, the words didn't soften me. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor, and the sound echoed like a final punctuation mark. "You shaped me to survive without love," I said, my voice calm but unbreakable, "and now you don't get to touch the life I built from that pain." The cool air outside brushed my face as I stepped away, leaving their apologies hanging uselessly in the background. Walking down the street, the world felt clearer, lighter, as if the weight I carried for years had finally dissolved. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the invisible achiever anymore. I felt impossible to erase.